All right, well, welcome everyone to SESE Colloquium. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest, Andy Ridgewell from UC Riverside, who's going to give us a presentation about something we don't hear too much about here in SESE, which is climate modeling, in particular climate modeling applied to ancient Earth history. A few words about that in a second, but first a bit about Andy's background. So Andy got his undergraduate degree at Cambridge University, and then PhD at University of East Anglia. And then he moved across the Atlantic, which he did a couple times during his career, and did a postdoc at UC Riverside, which then led to a faculty position at University of British Columbia. And then he went back to the UK to take a faculty position at Bristol. And then he decided, Riverside wasn't so bad after all. And so he went back to UC Riverside, where he's been for, I don't know, how long now? 7, 8 years? Yeah, 7, 8 years as faculty at UC Riverside. So along the way, Andy developed expertise in using climate models to study Earth's past. Climate models, as you probably know, are used extensively to try to study Earth's future, to try to predict what the future of the climate's going to be. But there's also lots of interest in trying to figure out what the climates of Earth's past were, which requires a different approach to climate modeling, because some of the detailed things we do in full-up climate models, GCMs, that we use for the future, you can't apply to the past when the continents were in different places and all sorts of things were happening. You also need to, if you're going to apply models to the past, is think about changes, big differences in biogeochemical cycles and environmental parameters that you don't need to worry about so much when you're doing near-term future climate modeling. And so Andy became an expert in thinking about how one does this, and then in thinking about the implications for ecosystems and trying to figure out how to parameterize that in these models. And so that's what Andy does. What's very refreshing, there are many things that are very refreshing about Andy and entertaining, but one of them is he understands the limitations of models. There's a real temptation in the world of climate modeling to view the model as reality, but the model is not reality. There's a famous saying that many of you have probably heard, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. Andy is very good at making that point, and I suspect will raise all sorts of questions about the usefulness even of his models as we talk about this. But they're insightful, right? They get us to think in different ways and open up possibilities and test the plausibility of certain hypotheses that people have when they don't apply quantitative numerical modeling. So with that, turn it over to Andy to tell us about numerical recipes for a marine biosphere.
This is working? This is working. It's good. It's good for a computer programmer. I only had one switch to flip, and I managed to flip the switch. So for those of you online, I'm going to use the laser pointer because I can't get the mouse to work because I'm a computer programmer, and how can I get a mouse to work? But I will try and describe the bits that I'm pointing at with the laser pointer. So I just want to set a little bit of context, a little bit of motivation for the talk, and I'm not going to worry about the details on this slide. At the bottom, there are some cartoon, bottom middle, some cartoon timelines of when different things evolved. When the first, cyanobacteria evolved, when eukaryotes evolved, when animals evolved, and then some other things about when different sort of phytoplankton species evolved. So, profound, it's an understatement to say that profound events have occurred in the evolutionary history of life on this planet. Profound changes in the climatic and geochemical composition of the surface of the Earth have also occurred. So at the top, there's a rendition of some reconstructions of atmospheric CO2 over the past 400 million years, a little cartoon of when some of the ice ages over the last 400 million years have come and gone. And, my interest is sort of like, what's the relationship between these two things? So one way is easy. In fact, both ways is easy. So, as life evolved, the ocean, the surface of the Earth became oxygenated and trace metals became less available, perhaps. Carbon was sequestered, CO2 was drawn down, maybe like the climate cooled. So there are a lot of like geochemical climatic consequences of different evolutionary innovations. There are also, going the other way around, there are a lot of, biological, ecological consequences of climate changes. The greatest extinction to occur in Earth history was at the end of the Permian, and we think it was driven by massive volcanism. There have been meteorite impacts. There have been a variety of environmental perturbations that have changed ecology and sort of reset or changed the direction of evolution. So these are two one-way things. And my interest and my sort of overarching question, which I won't actually fully answer by the end of the talk, is are these two things, how are these two things related? What is a system like? How does a system behave where the evolution of life affects the environment and the environment then guides the evolution of life? It's called a feedback. And it's sort of my overarching motivation for, a lot of my research and picking at bits of this puzzle is like what does such a system look like? How does it behave? Does it help us better understand the evolutionary history of this planet and maybe other planets? And specifically, and I'm not going to go through this data slide, it's some data we reconstructed of basically what plankton live in the ocean from the impact of the Cretaceous for the next 10 million years forward. The questions really, so like everyone knows the dinosaurs died, but a lot of large phytoplankton went out, leaving just the small ones. And that remained the case for some millions of years. The carbon cycle was weird. Everything was a little bit weird in the ocean. It persisted for a long time. And then gradually, the carbon cycle recovered in the ocean. Ecology, started to recover over 10 million years, the diversity that existed before the impact. So there were some interesting ecological things that occurred in the ocean. And that this is a sort of specific interest of mine in terms of modeling. So how do we go about creating a model for life, for evolution, for how life may have interacted with the environment through the evolutionary history of the planet? I'm going to take an analogy from the ocean, from climate. So how do we, let's take a step back from marine ecology and evolution, because biology is hard. Like I like to say, maths is easy, physics is a little bit less easy, chemistry is getting much less easy, biology is hard, ecology, is impossible. It's like the most difficult thing to understand. So let's look at some physics. So how do we understand what the ocean does? In terms of like its physical state, how does the ocean circulate, mix, transport heat and salinity around? So how do you build a model, basically? So, you start with what you think you know. I guess there are several parts to building a model, like what you know, what you think is important. You have to decide what to put in the computer program. You can't put the behavior of every single atom on Earth. Even if you could, you couldn't calculate what they did. So you have to in your mind encapsulate what you think are the most important processes that are going on. And it does relate somewhat on your question. So what are the most important processes that are most critical to the question that you have in mind? So you might conceive of the ocean as, it has a surface that's warmer and things live. And so you might create a box for the surface ocean. And maybe you're just interested in near-term future climate change, and the ocean surface is critical for absorbing heat, whereas the deep ocean hasn't really noticed very much. So you might have a second box at the bottom for the entirety of the deep ocean because it's not really essential to your question. You might then think, well, we know more about the ocean circulation, just like there's a surface and a deep, there's some sort of like circulation around the ocean. So you might add a third box. So here there's like a deep high latitude box. And we know that from observations that deep water tends to be formed at high latitudes. Deep water sinks, so there's an arrow down from the deep box representing like there's some net transport of water from the surface down to depth. At high latitudes, you're now constrained a little bit mathematically by this model has to make sense, it has to conserve water. So we have upwelling at low latitudes to complete this flow from sinking at high latitudes, flow through the deep, and then upwelling at lower latitudes. Although you might question whether that's actually what our planet looks like. So this is good, but in creating models, you're encapsulating what you think are the most important things. And you may not be correct. And if you parameterize, if you look at the ocean today, so we start with creating models based on observations because it's something we know, and it's something we can test the model against. Is this circulation say, what happened in the Cretaceous. So if I'm interested in extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, and I'm interested in marine organisms in the ocean after the Cretaceous impact, I want to get the circulation right if I can in a model that might have ecology and evolution, all sorts of things. So is such a box model with high latitude sinking good for the Cretaceous? I mean, I would have put the numbers in for the modern. Is that true for the Cretaceous? I don't know. Maybe it isn't. Does it work for future climate change? We know the ocean is stratifying. We know that deep water formation is weakening. If you've created a model with these fixed fluxes that go round and round and round forever, it's maybe not good in a transient sort of state for future climate change. It's maybe not good for the Cretaceous. So we need a better approach than too tightly encapsulating the things that we see today about the large scale structure of the ocean. So of course, this is long ago, decades ago, been solved by general circulation models. So these are representations of the system based on the underlying physics. So you still have boxes, but you have many, 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 many boxes. And each box is told about density and momentum and the Coriolis force. And that you don't tell the model what the circulation is. You let the physics tell you what at least a self-consistent, plausible circulation will be. You're hoping when you construct a model of the modern ocean based on fundamental physics and set it going, it gives you an ocean that looks like the modern ocean, although there's no guarantee it does that. But this is sort of, you know, where climate modeling is and has been for a long time. And this is, I'll talk about in a few minutes, where I think ecology could move to. So the point is that the structure of the ocean, the circulation, becomes an emergent property of the underlying rules. And the underlying rules in this case is just the physics of the fluid on a rotating sphere. I'm going to give you a little example. So this is the sort of model I use, and you're looking at it and you're thinking, what are all those sharp corners? Like this, is this made from Lego? So it's low resolution. All models are like this. All models are boxes. Within each which you have to assume everything is uniform in concentration. The best climate models just have so many boxes that it's very difficult to see that they're made of boxes. But this is how models are. So this is the late Jurassic. You can see in the middle, this is the Tethys, the remainder of the Tethys. At the very bottom, you can't really tell. I can tell you that Antarctica is joined to Australia, that is joined to South Africa. There is a shape south of the equator. There is South America joined to Africa. North America hasn't separated from Europe yet, and nor is there a passage all the way through from between North America and South America. Anyway, so that's the context. You can ask, is it like the modern ocean in terms of circulation? So I don't have plots for the temperature field. It's warmer in the Jurassic. The water is very, very salty in the Tethys because it's in the tropics. You have a lot of evaporation, a lot of salts left behind, and we'll see what happens with the system. But you might expect if you just build a box model of the modern ocean, it's all sinking at the pole, and it does that forever. So let's just run this forward. This will be the worst animation you've ever seen in your life. I'm going to click it. Such an amateur mistake. There we go. So what I'm actually plotting is the colors at age of the water in terms of when did it last see the surface. So blue is water that's only very, very recently seen the surface. So some of the, I'll tell you what you're actually seeing in a minute. So some of the blue, like in the Tethys, is simply because the ocean is shallow. And so it's very close to the surface. And so you could say it's young water. The dark reds are where water has been isolated from the atmosphere or isolated from the surface ocean for a long, long time. So as we go through this animation, you'll see it starting, the deep ocean starts to get older and older. So here it's 3,000 years, 4,000 years. The modern ocean is no older than 1,500. Getting up to 5,000 years, you see some like little wobbles in the Tethys. So that's the sea on the right-hand side of the equator. And it wobbles around a little bit. And then suddenly, in a minute, everything goes blue. So what happens is the deep ocean has become, it's been ventilated from the tropics with very warm water, but very salty water. So initially it's denser than everything else. At some point you build up this instability between the density at the high latitudes at the surface and this warm, salty deep water, and the entire ocean mixes very rapidly over a few hundred years. So this is not something you'd guess from a box model. So the box model is a static representation of what you think, for instance, the modern ocean looks like. When you put some dynamics in, weird things can happen. So did this ever happen? Did this happen during the Jurassic? I don't know. There are proxy data, the sort of thing Ariel does. You know, we could maybe take this model and see whether it matches observations. So it's testable, but it's an illustration of when you put some fundamental rules into a mathematical representation of here ocean circulation, unexpected things can happen. These may be real or they may not be real, but you would never get this if you on and move forward with that. Okay, so what about ecology? So I'm going to go through very quickly in the next few slides because it's really, they're the same cartoons. I don't have that many cartoons. We can make the same analogy with how do you construct a representation of ocean circulation? We can say, well, what are the most important things about the ecology of today's ocean? Phytoplankton. So here is a box. There's a box with now phytoplankton at the top and zooplankton. We know zooplankton is something that's got to eat all these plants. So we have zooplankton raised on the phytoplankton. It's like a two-box model. Well, not two boxes of different parts of the ocean, but two boxes of different parts of the ecosystem. So we could start with that. We could add a third box, and people do. So here, like, you might have a diatom box. And there are two different sorts of phytoplankton, one zooplankton that's grazing them both. There's going to be some dynamics of this. How do we know how to represent diatom growth in a model? You go to experiments, you see how well they grow when they have lots of phosphate, how well they grow when they don't have lots of phosphate, how well they grow at higher temperatures, lower temperatures, more or less silicic acid. And you parameterize how these things grow and eat something else based on typically modern species in lab experiments. So then we can have the same sort of questions and criticisms of a box model of ecology, just as we had criticisms for a box model of the ocean. It's like, well, will this still work in the future under a dynamically changing global environment? Will this work for the Cretaceous? And that's an easy question to answer because there weren't many diatoms in the Cretaceous. You go back further, little cartoon at the very bottom right. If you go back to 300 million years, there weren't any diatoms haven't evolved. So if you set up your model based on modern species and very carefully parameterize those modern species based on observations, it is not relevant for going back in deeper time. So we need a more flexible approach. And this is, where this talk is going. I have like a partial answer at the end. So we need the equivalent of that physics model for the ocean. We need the physics of ecology and evolution. It's like, well, what the hell is that? So one thing, we need some rules. So a simple rule is big fish eat little fish that eat even little fish. So there is a size structure to ecology in the modern world. There's maybe some exceptions, shortcuts, like, I guess sperm whales can eat plankton, which is like a real scale difference, but everything in general is eating something that's smaller. So we can think of like how to construct models, pick at the rules, like size is going to be one rule that's going to be helpful. We can, I can skip over this. So we've built a model based on size. We've embedded it in effectively that awful animation of the Jurassic ocean circulation. You saw the Lego box world. Well, it's a fast model. So I could have a very, very pretty high resolution model, but maybe it's going to take me a supercomputer to, 6 months of a supercomputer to run 50 years. If we want to address ultimately evolutionary timescales, geological events and timescales, we need simple, fast models, and this is the sort of model we use. So we can take that flexible structure. So it's the ecosystem is based on size. There are a whole bunch, 8 typically, of different size classes of phytoplankton. There are 8 different size classes of zooplankton. The big zooplankton can eat the smaller zooplankton, that can eat the smaller zooplankton, and the big zooplankton can eat the smaller phytoplankton and also eat the smaller phytoplankton. So there are trophic links within the zooplankton eating each other, but based on size. and between the zooplankton and the phytoplankton, again based on size, and then of course the photoautotrophs, the phytoplankton are competing with each other for nutrients. So there is like a, although we just have two different classes of size, the generic phytoplankton and a generic zooplankton, there's quite a lot of richness of ecological interaction. And we can configure this model, for instance, if we're interested in, so the thing about models is, so for future climate change, we don't have a time machine. So your climate model is your prediction, if you want to call it prediction. I mean, a better word is projection. So what might the future look like? Your model is the only thing to find out what happens before it happens. What about the past? I don't like to look at, I don't like to phrase it as making predictions of the past or making projections of the past. It's more scenarios. What things are possible in the past that then might look like the data? The model is just a self-consistent realization of how the physics and biology and chemistry might go. It might be wrong, but the point is we can test it against the data. So for instance, if we're interested in what was the sort of like nature of the ecosystem after the Cretaceous impact and how did that affect carbon cycling, we can just use a model to test some different ideas, test hypotheses. The hypothesis might be, like this is the box at the top right, that there were just a couple of small zooplankton or phytoplankton left after the extinction. And then the model can tell you what would the ocean look like? What would the carbon cycle look like if that was the case? And so a couple of the panels, there's like the color panels are just some measure of diversity of the phytoplankton in the model. And this is in a Cretaceous, little box world Cretaceous configuration. The second row is export production. It's just a measure of how productive is the ocean. How strong is the carbon cycle in the ocean? And the five different rows are just different assumptions about what is in the ocean. Are there only just small things left? Are there just, for instance, in the bottom right, maybe there's a whole range of different phytoplankton, but just one small zooplankton left that didn't go extinct? Or are there lots of different zooplankton, but just one small phytoplankton that didn't go extinct? We can play some games. Models are for the future, it's your simulation tool, it's your predictive tool. But really, models are hypothesis testing tools. They're not meant to be, this is what the Cretaceous looked like. They're meant to be, if we assume this is the nature of Cretaceous ecosystems, do any of these look like the data? So, so beyond that, so what other strategies can we do to model what's in the ocean and what the dynamics are? So, this is a cartoon of an ability of an organism. And this is the growth rate as a function of temperature. It has a happy temperature where it grows best. A little bit hotter, it's going to die. A little bit colder, it grows slower. And eventually, at very, very cold temperatures, it will also die. This optimal temperature is called a trait. And we'll come back to traits in a minute. It's like a little bit of superpower. It's like, how strong is your temperature superpower? This is the trait. So ideally, we would like to model these individual species. I should look it up. How many species of plankton are there in the ocean? I know, 10,000. There are not a small number of different species in the ocean. Ideally, a perfect model, why not have all of them, right? Because maybe they're all important. Maybe all the diversity of the different phytoplankton is key to understanding the carbon cycle. It's too difficult we don't know enough about them all. Numerically, in computers, we don't have enough processing power to put them all in. So there are some cheats. Well, not cheats. There are some approximations which current Earth system models use. One is to note that you can sort of draw a line through those temperature optima, so those trait values. What is the happiest temperature that all the different species live at? You can sort of put a line through that, and then you can say, what? Rather than trying to represent 10,000 different plankton in the ocean and all their interactions with each other, let's just say we could have, say, a generic plankton that follows this temperature curve. And that's basically what's used in current models. And does it matter? So here's a cartoon of starting with some baseline state. Let's call it pre-industrial. Let's say that like some idiot has thrown CO2 into the atmosphere and there's global warming. So, you know, the temperature, the sea surface temperature those plankton experience now goes higher. You see the growth rate goes up. Then let's say that fortunately someone has sequestered all that carbon and global temperature comes back down again. So then this is the third panel down, cooling. And then at some point, actually it's 100,000 years or more, at some point when the CO2 gets removed from the system fully, you're back to your initial climate state. And the thing about this is nothing's happened between the top and the bottom. I mean, I think that, you know, one of the greatest concerns about the future are extinctions. You know, and we see extinctions, you know, much more clearly on land because we've hunted the various things to death, or they're about to be hunted to death, and you know that's also similar for some of the larger mammals in the ocean. So we worry about extinctions. Really, our models should be able to tell us when things go extinct. But this is smoothly reversible. This is completely reversible. So there's no extinctions in this modeling approach. So we could say, well, what if we do model each and every species, or we model, we represent their possible presence. So now it's sort of the same, but we're not taking that solid line approximation to how does temperature affect, you know, marine productivity and growth rate. We're now saying we're going to model each of these different species. So then the second panel down, the warming, we no longer have the cold adapted ones. So let's just say the Southern Ocean, the Arctic, everywhere is warm now. You don't have cold species. You wouldn't have polar bears. And then there's cooling. And like the model knows that these things exist, right? I mean, at least that would be, you know, the typical approach you're going about it. You defined biomass for all these species, you lose the biomass, and then as you cool, the species come back again. And then the very bottom panel, the idea is it looks the same as the top one. So there's no extinctions in this. And what we want is something that looks like this third one. So it's, you warm up, you lose the cold adapted ones. When you cool down, they're not there. So that third panel down is important because in terms of if you integrated, say, the area under these curves and said claimed it was something about, you know, it's some measure of global carbon production, it's different from the top one. We've lost a component, we've had extinctions. And then eventually you reestablish climate. These things are going to re-evolve, although you're not going to get the same species back again. So that's why the curves in the very bottom panel are very subtly different from the top ones. Just to, you know, these are cartoons. You know, the curves, the cartoon curves at the bottom are very subtly different from the top ones, just to indicate that there will be a period where you've had extinctions and the world is different. Eventually, these things should re-evolve. You know, if there's somewhere cold with nutrients and no one else is in it, there is a selective pressure to evolve to be able to live there. But you won't necessarily get the same things back. So, you know, if polar bears go extinct in 100 million years' time, if we have a cryosphere again, will there be polar bears? There'll be some white animals, right? White is good. If you've got snow, you want to hide, you don't want to be seen by your prey. We won't necessarily get polar bears. So this is the weirdest bit. So I'm a modeler. What the hell did I do by training? It was like geology, it was mineral physics, it was solid state physics. Oh, yuck. Now I just write bad computer games. And I find myself, I have to talk about sort of ecology and evolution. So here goes. So I'm going to show you what are called fitness landscapes, which are two-dimensional trait things. All right, forget all those words. So let's say that you're very tall. You may be, or at least you have the potential to be good at basketball. So your superpower is like tall in basketball. And possibly the taller you get, the better at basketball you get. If you're 9 feet tall, you probably have other issues and you're not so good at basketball again. So your superpower might be height, but at some point, maybe 6'5", 7 foot, I don't know, gives you many advantages over most other people in basketball. Maybe too tall and you have other difficulties. So there is some ideal height. You know, you're competitive. You're more competitive than all your friends if, say, you're 6'8". Or you might be really powerful and stocky and do weightlifting. Now, if you're really tall, you're not going to be so good at weightlifting. And so there is going to be some physiological optimum where you're the best weightlifter in your class. I mean, you probably didn't do weightlifting here. But, you know, there's going to be some optimum where you're the best at weightlifting. And that might be the second trait, the second different superpower you could have. And, you know, there could be some combinations of height and muscle mass that then make it good for football or something, you know, so there could be some peaks of success in sport where your combination of height and muscle mass is really good for rowing or, you know, football or something. So this is the fitness landscape. So it's not a physical two-dimensional space. It's a space of the degree to which you have these two different superpowers. Maybe you're in a corner, you're low muscle mass, very tall, or you're very stocky and short and very good at football, or there's some combination that gives you a sweet spot of being much better than everyone else at sport. So let's see what this looks like. So this is just some really disturbing thing. You'll have bad dreams about this. This is just something I pulled off the internet because the internet is full of things that give you bad dreams. This is meant to represent a population of species, of individuals with two different superpowers, two different degrees of the two different superpowers. And these peaks are just where these sports, where the optimal point is in height, you know, muscle mass to be best at this sport. And these things evolve. So like you can't evolve through, you know, your college degree. But you know, in 10,000 years of human selection, you might select for athletes who, you know, are particularly good at one sport or another sport. So these things evolve in a numerical land so that they become optimal for whatever they're doing. There's another version of this, which is much more disturbing. This will give you much worse dreams. I like to think of it this way. Let's say that you've deglaciated part of the Arctic, and it's bare soil. It's maybe just quartz sand and stuff. Like, and you're a plant and you could colonize this, but there's no nitrogen in the soil. You know, this is real rubbish stuff, it's sand. So what if you could start to develop nitrogen fixation? This is your superpower. So you can outcompete everyone else. No one else can grow here. There's no nitrogen. You're fixing nitrogen in your roots. So you're successful. You climb the peak. Like the fitness peak is where the most successful combination of traits or superpowers is. That's one part of it. As you know, you're happy, you're ruling the world, you've taken over this newly glaciated landscape. As you grow and die, like each season, you're putting biomass and nitrogen in the soil. So now you're moving the goalposts, you could call this. So now it's not, the more you survive and prosper, the more the soil changes to support your competitors. So you're modifying the environment by evolving nitrogen fixation. You're modifying the environment to now make it less favorable for you and more favorable for someone who doesn't spend the effort fixing nitrogen. So this is the cartoon, like as those little things, creepy things, like evolve this combination of superpowers to be the best. They change the environment. And really, to be best, now you have to be somewhere else. You have to be different. You have to do less nitrogen fixation. You grow taller, and you shade out the stupid nitrogen fixers who are wasting all their time and energy on nitrogen fixation. So anyway, so this is, you know, this is where, you know, my research is, you know, my ideas are going. And like, well, what is this interaction between the evolution of life and you modify the environment, which now feeds back on that selective pressure for further evolution. So we're going to play out, so it's the last few slides. We're going to play out a little game in the model. I have a trait space, so just like this weird, creepy 2D thing. The trait space is going to be size, because we decided that size is a good, simple thing to start, you know, a good, simple rule to start creating an ecosystem from. And then we're going to do this weird thing called mixotrophy. So there aren't many things on land that do mixotrophy. A mixotroph is a plant that's an animal. Well, it's not quite like that. So Venus flytrap is a plant. It photosynthesizes. But if it can get a juicy fly, it digests the fly. So it's something that is a photoautotroph, but it's hedging its bets and it's going to eat someone else. So it's like a mix of heterotrophy, which is like zooplankton, and autotrophy, which is like phytoplankton, and you're going to like try and find a middle ground. And the idea would be if nutrients are sparse, you eat your friend, and if there are plenty of nutrients, you photosynthesize. So you can sort of switch, you can change the balance of how to survive. So this is how the model is going to be constructed. I'm going to take you through, there are only 3 slides. There are 2 slides and a really weird animation. And then we're done. So this is the trait space. We basically predefined the possible existence of 1,000 different species. And these species are all distinguished by a different combination of superpowers. So on the x-axis is the degree of mixotrophy, meaning that at the very, very left-hand edge is your pure photoautotroph. You're just a little phytoplankton that's just going to take sunlight, nutrients, and fix carbon. On the far right-hand side, you can't be bothered to photosynthesize. You're just going to eat everyone inside. So you're a zooplankton. So that's pure heterotroph on the right-hand side. And we allow in the model the possible existence of all sorts of in-betweens. Cells that maybe have a few chloroplasts, but also a vacuole to digest your friends. And then on the y-axis is how large you are. What is the diameter of your cell, assuming it's a simple sphere? So at the very bottom, I can't remember the scale. 1 micron point, I don't know. So at the bottom is small, and it goes up about 3 orders of magnitude of spherical diameter to the top. So that's trait space. So this big grid is not the world or a planet or latitude and longitude or anything to do with distance. It is what is your degree of superpower of eating someone else on the x-axis, and what is your superpower of size on the y-axis. And then these are actually postage stamps. The tiny, tiny blocks are actually a map of the world in terms of the distribution of chlorophyll at the surface. I mean, it's not so, it's not going to be so useful to follow these, but that's just what the colors are. And then the very border in the green along the very bottom and along the edges are just the sum of everything along the very, very bottom, the sum of all the columns in terms of biomass. So all the different size classes added up in terms of biomass. And on the very right-hand edge is, for the same size class, all the biomass in all the different degrees of mixotrophy. And at the very, very, very bottom right-hand corner is the sum of all biomass in the ocean as a spatial distribution. So this is weird. So this is 1,000 worlds, but the grid is these traits. And the way this game plays out is we seed the ocean with only tiny photoautotrophs. So the smallest pure photosynthesizers are put into the ocean. We do not have, so this is a model without mutation. So we do this simple approximation, which is called trait diffusion. We just basically say, if you're successfully growing somewhere, we're going to move a very small amount of your biomass into the next possible species. So if you're very successful and you're small in a photoautotroph, you get a very small amount of biomass moved into a very slightly larger photoautotroph. And if that's not successful, it dies out. If it is successful, then evolution might proceed to larger and larger size classes. So let's not worry about the questions. These are questions you could. So if you're online and you have to be tested later, jot down these 4 questions, and you get an A, except the very last one. You could ask the last one. Anyway, so second to last, and I'll show the animation. This is just a visualization to show that actually this model, shockingly, has some real world properties, because it looks very artificial, right? It is very artificial. It's a model. This is animation time on like the bottom left-hand axis from 0 to 3,000 years. So it's a very accelerated evolution. Let's not kid ourselves that we're modeling 4.5 billion years of Earth history here. On the very bottom right axis, so it's a three-dimensional plot, is trophic strategy. So this is the autotroph, which is the A, to heterotroph, the zooplankton, which is the H. So as you go from left to right, you're getting more, you more want to eat all your friends than you do want to put the effort into photosynthesis. And then on the y-axis is simply the size. So this grid at the back is simply this thing we just saw. So the grid at the back is effectively this. And then it just comes out in the front because this is how things go through time. So if you look at the very, very bottom left in green, you can't really see it, but it starts with, like I said, it starts with just a tiny photoautotroph everywhere. So we could make other assumptions about the start, but this is what we did. If you follow it through time, i.e., as these colors start coming out of the page towards you, you'll see that still in the green, the first thing that happens is things just get bigger. They don't start eating anything else yet. They just getting bigger. And this is because the model is initialized with this phosphate everywhere. So if you start very small, but there's still lots and lots of phosphate, you evolve much bigger because you can make a good living with lots of nutrients around. Gradually, things move across to the right, which means that, say, as nutrients start running out and you're looking around and thinking, I can't find any phosphate, my friend has lots of phosphate in their cell, you start eating your friend. So there is a movement of things evolving to start being heterotrophic because as nutrients become scarce, you make your living by eating other people. That's life, isn't it? And then, like, there's some interesting branching, like the very top going way, it goes from blue into purple and stops. That's an extinction. That's a lineage that's evolved. It's evolved a good living as a very large mixotroph. Then it goes extinct. There are, it's difficult to see if you're online. There's like a white branch that merges with a light green branch. That's effectively coemergent evolution. That's you start two different species, but you end up basically doing exactly the same thing. So there's actually some interesting properties here. I won't show you that Cretaceous data again, but actually we can tie, and we did in a paper, we tied in this exact behavior to some of the things we see in the fossil record. So it's actually surprising, a relatively simple model with simple rules can have some very rich real world looking evolutionary behavior. I'm not saying it is real world. Anyway, so this is it. I'm going to start it. This is the grid. Again, we're starting at small, little postage stamp. There's nothing in the ocean except everywhere is a very, very small phytoplankton, and we're just going to run it through in time. It's effectively the same as the previous visualization. So everything jumps up very large to begin with. Then, like, you start getting things evolving to be more and more heterotrophic, and that's that big movement along until it hits the right-hand edge, and that's now you have a lot of pure normal zooplankton. And you end up, by the end of the animation, it's going to loop over with a range of small to medium photoautotrophs, phytoplankton, and then a range of like medium to larger heterotroph zooplankton. If you look in the very, very top, those are the very large mixotrophs that just don't go anywhere. They sort of head right, then, so that's the lineage that goes extinct. At some point, being a huge mixotroph, when there aren't nutrients to be huge and you can't find anything to eat either, it became like a real dead end. But at least you evolved to that point because at least, the environment and your, coexisting ecosystem is suitable to evolve a very large heterotroph. But at some point, everything changes. You wake up one day and the world is different. Everything's online. And you sort of either very quickly evolve in a different direction or you go out. I mean, this is as far as the research has got. So it's a toy world, but we can play evolutionary-like games in that has some connection to the fossil record, which is sort of surprising, given that it's couldn't have done anything. It just has all these rules that don't determine, there's nothing predetermined about what this is going to do when we set it running. And that's sort of it, and it's sort of about time. And there's my collaborators. Something about statistics. So I did show this slide to my collaborators. So that's like a pretend regression line, right? everyone complained. Everyone who was below the line complained they should be, they said they want to be above the line. The little I know about statistics is not every value can be above the mean, right? So apologies to whoever in this. So this is like a trait space of programming ability versus like nanofossil paleoecology ability. And it's a trade-off because maybe you can't be the best programmer and the best person looking down the microscope, recognizing different species of nanofossils. So anyway, thanks to all my collaborators, mostly from previous university and grants in the UK and Bristol. And I'll take any questions, like obviously remember the 4 questions. And that's your job done already. Thank you.
We have time for questions. So I don't know, Rick, are you moderating the
Yes,
online ones?
I will watch the chat if anybody wants to drop a question in there, and we
Great.
will hand microphones to people that have questions.
Why don't we start with students?
Hi, pardon for my lack of background in this, but the first simulation that you showed, I was just curious what the contours in that simulations were.
So I can quickly. I mean, they're just the contours of the color. So this is, the color is the age of the water since it was last at the surface. So if you imagine, if you went to the North Atlantic today, at the surface, the age is effectively 0. At some point, it's gonna, in the winter, it's gonna convect down. That water parcel is gonna move down maybe a kilometer in the North Atlantic, and gradually, it's gonna head south with the large-scale circulation of the Atlantic. And as it heads south, every year it's a year older. So in the model, it's a numerical tracer for ventilation, if you like. So the blue has very, very recently seen the surface. And in some places, like in the Tethys, that's simply because it's very shallow and the water basically is at the surface. And in other places and situations, if it's very blue, it might be because it's being mixed very, very rapidly to depth. And then the redder colors, is water that has not seen the surface of the ocean for a long, long time. And this is important in terms of life because the longer water sits down there without being ventilated with oxygen from the surface, the more anoxic it becomes, then euxinic, and then animals can't live. So you could look at the colors. So light blue is the oldest deep North Pacific water today. So it gets very, very, very old, which may have interesting implications for what could be living in the deep ocean during the Jurassic. And then it has this fascinating, it's a situation that just isn't ultimately physically stable. The water at the very bottom of the ocean everywhere is very, very salty, which is good for density, but it's also very, very warm. And at some point, this becomes a mistake. And the whole ocean basically flips upside down. And that's why it goes suddenly all blue. And then the system, this is actually a stable oscillation of about 20,000 years that would occur forever in the model. Which is interesting because there are Milankovitch cycles that are about 20,000 years, and people use that to tell time. And so if there are natural cycles that might dominate the geological record, that could have some interesting sort of implications for what people are looking at when they try and do time in the geological record. In the tropics, that's the most incredible thing. I spent 20 years modeling, laughing at the old ideas for me. Could you get tropical deep water formation? And the answer is yes and no. So it does. You do get tropical deep water formation, but ultimately it's not stable. So the tropical, for the Tethys, the warm salty water floods the deep ocean and it makes it stagnant and it sits there for 20,000 years. But ultimately it becomes convectively unstable. It actually ventilates from the poles eventually. It's sort of continuous from the Tethys, but I think it becomes less and less effective. And then it effectively forms deep water at the poles very, very, very rapidly. And then it forms deep water in the Tethys again. And then that peters out and it becomes unstable and it flushes from the poles. So it forms deep water at the poles and goes blue. And then it keeps cycling like it. We do get exactly this in a fully coupled climate model in the same period, which is sort of a surprising thing about this simple model, that we can get some You could also say that the fully coupled model, you don't believe it, but at least to me, seeing this sort of thing in something more complex as well, and I'm using this because I can play lots and lots of games with this and run it for hundreds of thousands of years and try other parameters and tweak it and explore it and try and understand why is it doing what it's doing.
Did you have another question? Because you had your hand up before.
Thanks. Very cool. My question is actually about your other animation, where I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about yeah, that's crazy. So it won't make very, very big phytoplankton. And it goes through this phase where mixotrophy is kind of marching across.
Yeah.
But there's structure in that shape, right?
Yeah.
It turns out you can make kind of big mixotrophs that are really in the middle.
Yeah.
And then there's,
although
Can
they
you-
do they do
can you talk a little bit about the finer structure thing?
I thought it was just like nice to look at.
Tell us why you don't want to.
So you never get really large phytoplankton simply because by the time you start evolving slightly larger phytoplankton, there aren't enough nutrients anywhere. So we did start this model up with nutrients everywhere. So the ocean starts fully homogeneous and mixed. So when the plankton start evolving from the bottom left, there's lots and lots of phosphate in the surface ocean. So they get big quite quickly. I mean, quickly because we don't have like a proper evolutionary timescale. But they effectively evolve medium size really quite quickly, very, very rapidly because there's lots of phosphate. But they've been changing the environment as they go. And by the time they've evolved like intermediate sizes, there isn't much phosphate at the surface. So they never get way up to the top left simply because they've changed the environment faster than they can evolve to be big enough to take advantage of lots of nutrients. So by the time they get halfway up, now they're looking around thinking like, now there's not enough nutrients. So it now becomes a strategy to start eating someone else. So the march across the middle is sort of fairly straightforward. Why does it have this extinction branch with very large mixotrophs at the top? I don't know. I'd have to, this was like a postdoc's work, and I'd have to look into their model. I mean, you end up, the very final state is sort of prescribed by the basic rules, that you've got a size structure of small to medium-sized phytoplankton, and then like sort of more medium to large zooplankton, which is simply is really just a consequence of the rules of grazing. That it's typical of models. You assume about an order of magnitude. Your preferred prey generally is about an order of magnitude smaller than you are. And so the final structure is a little bit determined by that assumption. You never get small heterotrophs because this is a good question. I think it's probably the difference between the smallest phytoplankton at the end and the smallest zooplankton at the end is probably that order of magnitude prey preference assumption. You could put much more complexity into this and say, well, another trait is something to do with active prey, hunting or something. This was almost the simplest trait space we'd come up to. It's pretty wasteful from a modeling point of view. It's a little bit offensive because there are lots of things represented in the model that never exist. But the point, so like down in the bottom, and especially at bottom right, these things never evolve anywhere. But we're still representing this possibility in the model. We're actually transporting around things that basically have no biomass in case evolution wanted to go that way. So it is a predetermined combination of possible species of which a lot never evolve, and some evolve and go extinct. The way I want to take this, because that's wasteful, that's 1,000, if you know anything about like ocean circulation models, that's 1,000 species, and each species has about 4 properties in terms of nutrient quotas and carbon quotas and chlorophyll quotas and things. And so it's 4,000 things in the ocean are being transported around, whereas a typical future climate Earth system model maybe has 10. or 20 at the most. So it's numerically expensive. Actually, it's in a tracer transport model. So it's actually in a very clever encapsulation of the circulation that was generated in the real model. What I would like is to find a way of not predetermining the combinations, but letting a mutation get you to that specific combinations of powers. But you know, you just got to avoid. You can't have like 100,000 things in the ocean. So it's all a game of, rather than having to transport here 1,000 species, even though most never evolve, can I have, you know, 10 or 20 in every box, but every box could be different from the next box, which gives you millions. It's, you know, I'm sort of working on what is an approach in a three-dimensional ocean circulation model, because I want those feedbacks. I want that interaction between nutrient cycling and ultimately climate and evolution and ecology and the biological pump. How can I have, you know, an almost unrestricted evolution of plankton numerically, you know, like in terms of practicalities of computers and CPUs and memory and bandwidth and cache.
If it's a quick follow-up, we should probably see if there's an online question. Okay. Is it a quick follow-up? Yeah. That's what we gotta go to Mimi.
I haven't. So this is a postdoc on a project. I sort of, it's partly why I want to build a different sort of evolutionary model, because I regarded this as their thing. And so they you know, they developed it and did these simulations as part of the project, but I haven't, as much as I would like to think, because I'd like questions like, well, what if you start with a very large heterotroph, or you start with this, or you start them just in the North Pacific versus the Southern Ocean, or something, or something, or something. I very much regarded it as, you know, Ben Ward's thing, and so I haven't. So I don't actually have anything to say about. But you're right, there are some interesting little postage stamps that are very red next to one that isn't, and then, you know, there is this whole 2D trait space thing of evolution. But actually, every postage stamp has some interesting geographical distributions of biomass. And there's a lot here. That's one of the problems with models. You run them, you think, oh, we're done. Then it turns out you have this insane multi-dimensional space. This is a three-dimensional ocean in two-dimensional trait space in time at 6 dimensions. It's like my, you know, I need Q from Star Wars to tell me what it all means. So it's partly a visualization analysis problem at some point. Actually, running the model is easy, and then working out why it's done what it's done turns out in models to be the challenge.
Ming Ming.
Hello, my name is Ming Li. I'm also a modeler. I model the process of plate tectonics and mantle convection, a very long time scale. So my question to you is, I saw that your models are on a time scale of about 100,000 years. So could you like run your models for longer time, like millions or tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years? Like then consider the influence of deep mantle convection, like the volcanoes degassing, or these processes into your model. That be so
I would,
cool.
I would very, maybe we could email. I would very much like to be able to model and have something about the evolving solid Earth. I do run this model for not the evolutionary one. I do run my sort of like my global climate circulation geochemical models for, say, up to 10 million years. So at that point, really, I should be worrying about the plates moving, if nothing else. The thing about dynamical models is you can't change the boundary conditions. You can't, in a proper grown-up climate model, you cannot formally change an ocean cell to land. You cannot move, because the boxes are fixed in space. So it's on a grid, and you can't move a continent so that an ocean cell becomes land. There's a whole disaster of conservation of momentum, moisture and energy waiting for you there. So that's partly why no one's done it before. you know, I'm not sure. I always think like changing continents, say, is moving continents are changing the ocean circulation patterns, and I have papers on that. Whether the time to establish a new circulation is pretty quick compared with a very long time scale of meaningful movements of continents. So I think time slices, so fixed continents in time, but at intervals, I think is still a good approximation to say, how does the ocean circulation evolve during the Paleozoic?
Yes,
I think a bunch of slices is still good, and dynamical models do not. Like, you cannot, without them crashing, move land and water around. But I would very much like to have some long-term, really interesting, long-term scenarios of volcanism and hydrothermal, you know, mid-ocean ridge. Was, you know, those change in terms of length and position, and that would be really interesting.
Yeah, we should do something together. Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, in the geochemical version of this, I do have some like simple parameterizations of, you know, calcium, magnesium, and isotopes, and lithium, and you know, but really just mostly fixed fluxes. The fluxes from, say, mid-ocean ridges don't evolve with time. You know, I can always change them, but they are fixed. It would be interesting to have, you know, something a bit more dynamical from the solid Earth point of view, but I don't know at the moment. I do have a modeling concept in mind that will allow me to move the continents, but I don't have that model yet. And that then might be something to think about, more of an evolving with time solid Earth and fluxes.
Yes, thank you.
All right, and we're at time, speaking of time, so we should probably wrap up. So thank you very much. Again, that was a provocative talk and enlightening. And next week, I think we have another colloquium, right? I assume so. So tune in next week, or whatever is on the schedule. So thank you all very much. And let's thank Andy one more time.